I am Tessa Cohen, 27 years old, and I never thought that my own father, a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps, would be the one to stand by and watch as I was attacked. He was the one who personally pinned the lieutenant bars onto my collar and said that honor is all we have. So, when my cousin, Cade, broke into my barracks and assaulted me, leaving my face bruised, my arm broken, and my head bleeding onto the floor, all out of jealousy over a medal, I desperately searched for the hero I saw in my father's eyes. But instead, all I heard was his ice-cold voice, not speaking to Cade, but to me. Before I tell you my story, please let me know where you're watching from. And please support me by hitting the like button if you have ever been treated like a sacrifice for your family's honor. The concrete floor of my barracks room was cold against my cheek. The coppery tang of blood filled my mouth, sharp and metallic. A high-pitched ringing echoed in my ears, drowning out everything but the sound of my cousin's ragged, panting breaths. Cade stood over me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a frantic, ugly triumph. He was always like this, a storm of insecurity looking for something to break. Tonight, that something was me. He bent down, not to help me, but to pick up a shard of glass from the floor. It was a piece of the simple wooden frame that had held the only photograph I owned of my mother and me. He'd smashed it against the wall. Now, he pressed the jagged edge of the glass lightly against my cheek, just enough to make a point. "See this, Tessa?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "This is where you belong, always beneath me." He wasn't just trying to hurt me physically, he was trying to annihilate me symbolically, to grind my mother's memory into the dirt along with my face. Then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a guttural snarl. "Your mother was a weak woman, just like you." That was the moment the door swung open. A silhouette stood framed in the doorway, crisp and imposing. My father, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cohen. For a single stupid heartbeat, relief flooded through me. He's here. He'll stop this. I tried to push myself up, tried to call out to him, but my broken arm screamed in protest, a grinding crunch of bone that sent a wave of white-hot nausea through me. My vision swam. He stepped into the room, his polished dress shoes clicking with military precision on the linoleum floor. He took in the scene, the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, his daughter bleeding on the ground, and his nephew standing over her like a predator. His face was a mask of stone. Not a flicker of shock, not a hint of horror. Nothing. My eyes, already swelling shut, pleaded with him. "Help me, Dad. Please." He met my gaze. The silence in the room became absolute, a suffocating vacuum that was heavier than any sound. And in that silence, his words fell, not with the boom of a cannon, but with the chilling precision of a sniper's bullet. "You disappointed him, Tessa." The words hung in the air, colder than the steel of a bayonet. He wasn't speaking to Cade, he was speaking to me. "A real soldier knows when to stand down," my father continued, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "You pushed him to this." It wasn't just abandonment, it was a verdict. In his court of honor, I was the guilty one. The pain from my broken arm, the throbbing in my head, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. This new pain was sharper, deeper. It was the sickening realization that the man I had spent my entire life trying to impress, the hero of my world, was erasing me from my own story, right in front of my eyes. The next few minutes were a blur. The military police arrived, their boots heavy on the floor. But the moment they saw the silver eagle on my father's collar, their entire demeanor shifted. I saw the recognition, the deference. They looked at Cade, whose knuckles were still red, then at me, crumpled and broken. A young MP barely older than me met my eyes for a split second. I saw a flash of pity there, maybe even disgust at the scene, but it was extinguished as quickly as it appeared. He turned to my father, his posture immediately straightening. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful, formal. "We'll handle this internally." Internally. The word was a death sentence to the truth. It meant a cover-up. It meant reports would be buried and stories would be changed. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't just fighting my family. I was fighting an entire system built on rank, reputation, and a code of silence that protected its own, above all else. Hours later, I was at Womack Army Medical Center, the sterile white walls and antiseptic smell a stark contrast to the chaos. A doctor, efficient and detached, set my arm in a cast, the plaster hardening around the fracture. He talked about recovery times and physical therapy, but his words felt like they were coming from a million miles away. I was alone, sitting on the edge of the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath me. That's when she came in. She was an older nurse. Her name tag read Carla. Her face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from a lifetime of both smiling and worrying. She didn't say much. She just quietly placed a cup of warm water on the small table beside me. The simple gesture felt monumental. As she turned to leave, she paused and placed a gentle, firm hand on my shoulder. Her touch was the first warmth I had felt in what felt like an eternity. "Don't you let their voices drown out your own. You hear me, honey?" she whispered, her voice soft but steady. My own father was a man like that. Tears I didn't know I had left began to well up, hot and stinging. It was the first acknowledgement that I wasn't crazy, that what had happened was real and wrong. It was a tiny seed of validation in a world that had suddenly become hostile territory. In that quiet, sterile room, a verse my mother used to recite to me echoed in my mind. "The Lord is my strength and my shield." She'd say it whenever I was scared or felt small. But as I sat there, clutching the cup of water Carla had given me, I felt no shield. I felt utterly and completely exposed, and for the first time in my life, I knew I had to find a way to become my own. The painkillers they gave me at Womack did their job, wrapping my physical pain in a thick, dull fog. But they couldn't touch the other thing. The hollowed-out feeling in my chest where my family used to be. Lying in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, I did what any person does when they feel utterly alone. I reached for my phone. I was looking for a connection, a lifeline, anything to prove that the world I knew hadn't completely vanished. I found out it had. The first sign was small but sharp. The family group chat, the Cohen clan, was gone from my list. I searched for it, my thumb swiping clumsily, but it was like it never existed. I hadn't left. I'd been removed. Excised. A quiet, digital amputation. A wave of bitter bile rose in my throat. Then, out of some morbid curiosity I couldn't control, I navigated to Cade's public profile. And there it was. The second attack. This one was bloodless, but it cut just as deep. It was a new post, from only a few hours ago. A picture of him, smiling brightly, standing shoulder to shoulder with my father, both of them in their dress blues. My father's hand was on Cade's shoulder, a gesture of pride and approval. The caption read, "Proud to carry on the Cohen family legacy." My breath hitched. Below the picture, a flood of comments from aunts, uncles, and cousins I'd known my whole life. "Like uncle, like nephew, so proud. The family honor is in good hands, Cade." Not a single person asked where I was. Not a single person questioned the narrative. They were all participating, eagerly and publicly, in writing me out of history. I was a ghost they had all agreed not to see. The next day, after being discharged with my arm in a sling and a handful of prescriptions, I drove to my childhood home in Fayetteville. The house I grew up in. I needed to get my things, the pieces of my life that still belonged only to me. As I walked up the driveway, the familiar two-story colonial felt alien, like a stranger's house. Inside, it was quiet, too quiet. I walked through the living room, past the mantelpiece where my picture used to be. It was gone, of course. I went to my father's study, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the corner, next to the bookshelf, there was supposed to be a heavy, hand-carved oak chest, my mother's hope chest. It wasn't for linens or china. It was for memories. Inside was everything that was left of her journals bound in faded leather, stacks of letters tied with ribbon, photographs with soft, deckled edges. It was the one sacred thing in our house. It was gone. A cold dread, heavier than any fatigue, settled deep in my bones. I searched the house, a frantic, desperate energy propelling me from room to room. Closets, the attic, the garage, nothing. Finally, with nowhere else to look, I pushed open the back door and stepped out into the humid North Carolina air. And I saw it. In the far corner of the backyard, next to the overflowing trash and recycling bins, was a blackened, ugly pile. The acrid smell of smoke and damp ash hit me, a scent of absolute loss. I walked towards it slowly, my legs feeling like lead. It was the remains of the oak chest, its metal hinges twisted and warped by heat. They hadn't just burned it. They had thrown it out with the garbage, discarding my mother's entire life like it was nothing more than last night's coffee grounds. This was not an act of passion. This was a purge. I sank to my knees on the damp grass, the world narrowing to that pile of ash. I remembered sitting on the floor with my mom, the scent of cedar rising as she'd open the chest. She'd show me a letter from my grandmother, her fingers tracing the elegant script. "This is our story, Tessa," she'd say. "Never forget where you come from." Now all that was left was grit and soot. I plunged my good hand into the pile, the cold, gritty texture coating my skin. I sifted through the remains, hoping for something, anything, to have survived. But there was nothing but black dust and brittle curled fragments of paper that disintegrated at my touch. "Miss Tessa?" I looked up. Mr. Manuel, the gardener who had tended our yard since I was a little girl, was standing a few feet away, his straw hat held in his hands. His kind, weathered face was etched with a deep sadness. He was a good man, a man who had always had a quiet smile for me. There was no smile today. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the pile of ash. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice thick with a grief that wasn't his. "I saw him. I didn't have to ask who. It was yesterday morning," he continued, his gaze fixed on a distant tree. "Your father, Lieutenant Colonel Cohen, he carried the box out here himself." He took a shaky breath. "He did not light the match. He made the boy do it." "The boy?" "Cade." "He just stood there and watched," Mr. Manuel whispered. "He told him, 'Burn it all. We need to clean up the past.'" Clean up the past. The words echoed the cold emptiness in my chest. My mother, our memories, our story. To my father, it was all just dirt that needed to be swept away to preserve his perfect, polished image. Mr. Manuel's words were the final nail, confirming that this wasn't just Cade's jealous rage. This was a calculated execution, and my father was the one who had given the order. After Mr. Manuel left, offering me a silent, heartbroken nod, I stayed there, kneeling before the grave of my mother's memory. I don't know for how long. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard. With one last, desperate hope, I sifted through the cold ashes again. My fingers brushed against something with a different texture. It wasn't the brittle char of paper, but something thicker, more resilient. Carefully, I pulled it out. It was a small note card, maybe 4 by 6 inches. The edges were blackened and curled, but the center, somehow, was preserved. And on it, in my mother's beautiful, flowing handwriting, was a quote she must have copied down. "Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage." Brené Brown. I stared at the words, reading them over and over. The tears that had been blurring my vision finally stopped. The fire in the backyard had been put out, but a different kind of fire was starting to burn inside of me. A cold, controlled flame. They thought that by burning these letters, these pictures, these memories, they would break me. They thought they could turn my past to ash and leave me with nothing. But they were wrong. They had left me one thing. They had left me the truth. Clutching that small, fire-scarred piece of paper in my hand, I looked at the ruins of my mother's life. "You want to clean up the past?" I whispered to the silent, empty yard. "I will be the past you can never bury." Grief is a luxury. Anger is a fuel. But I was a Marine, and I knew that an uncontrolled fire burns itself out, leaving nothing but more ash. The cold resolve I felt kneeling in my mother's desecrated memories wasn't anger. It was something else. It was clarity. There was a quote from General James Mattis that we studied at Quantico. Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet. I had always understood it in the context of combat, but now, sitting in a cheap motel room off the highway, I saw it differently. My war wasn't in Syria anymore, it was here, in Fayetteville, and my plan wouldn't involve a single bullet. It would be fought with truth, politeness and professionalism would be my camouflage, and my objective wasn't to kill, but to dismantle. To systematically take apart the lies my father had built, piece by piece, until the entire rotten structure collapsed. My first objective was to secure my assets. The first and most vital asset was Nurse Carla. I drove back to Womack, not through the emergency entrance this time, but through the main doors. I found her on her break in the hospital cafeteria, stirring a cup of coffee. I walked up to her table, my posture straight, my voice steady. "Carla," I began, and she looked up, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. "I'm not here as a patient. I'm here because I need your help." I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the professional caution that comes with a 30-year career. A hospital is a political place, and the military is even more so. She knew who my father was. Helping me was a risk. "I need a witness," I said quietly, sitting down opposite her. "I need someone to testify, officially, to the state I was in when I was admitted. The bruises, the fracture, the lacerations." She looked down at her coffee, stirring it slowly. The silence stretched. I could see the internal debate playing out on her face. Fear for her job, her pension, versus a lifetime of seeing things she knew were wrong. Finally, she put the spoon down and looked me straight in the eye. A quiet fire had replaced the hesitation. "Honey," she said, her voice low but firm. "In my 30 years here, I've seen too many young women come through these doors with accidents. Too many who were told to stay quiet for the sake of a career or a family's name." She pushed a notepad and pen across the table to me. "You tell me what you need me to write, and I'll sign it in front of a notary this afternoon." She had just handed me my first weapon, a sworn affidavit. The first undeniable piece of medical evidence. The second piece of evidence was buried deeper. On the drive back from the hospital, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. My helmet cam. Before every mission in Syria, we were issued helmet-mounted cameras. I'd backed up all my footage onto a rugged, encrypted hard drive, a habit I'd picked up early on. I'd hidden that drive in the place I knew no one in my family would ever look, hollowed out inside an old copy of my mother's favorite book of poetry. But I couldn't access it at home. Not now. I drove 20 miles west to a small public library in a neighboring town, a place where no one would know my face. I found an empty computer terminal in the back, the old machine humming loudly. With my heart pounding, my senses on high alert, I plugged in the drive. After entering a series of passwords, a folder appeared. The video files were labeled by date. I found the one I was looking for. The footage was chaotic and grainy, just as I remembered. The sound of gunfire, shouting. Then, I saw it. Cade, pressed against a crumbling wall, his rifle shaking, his eyes wide with terror. And then, there was me. A figure moving with purpose, low-crawling out from cover to drag 2 wounded Marines from my platoon back into the safety of an alley. The audio was crystal clear. You could hear Cade's panicked breathing, and then the voice of the soldier whose leg I was bandaging. "Thanks, Cohen. You saved my ass." It was all there. The cowardice, the courage, the truth. This was my silver bullet. That night, my strategy shifted from gathering old evidence to finding new allies. I took a risk. I remembered hearing whispers about private online forums for servicewomen, places to talk about things you couldn't mention on base. After a few hours of digging through obscure subreddits, I found one. It was stark, anonymous, and heavily encrypted. Before I could even post, I reached out to an old friend from my intel unit. A few brief coded texts later, he sent me a link to an encrypted email service and a simple message. "Cover your tracks, T." Using a new anonymous account, I created a post. I kept it vague, clinical. Has anyone here ever had an official after-action report modified or falsified by a superior officer for reasons unrelated to mission accuracy? I logged off, not expecting much. When I logged back on an hour later, my encrypted inbox had 17 messages. By morning, it was over 50. They were from women in the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and my own beloved Corps. Stories of promotions denied, of credit for heroic actions given to men, of being silenced, sidelined, and gaslighted. One woman, a major in the Air Force, told a story so similar to mine it made my blood run cold. She had been decorated for bravery, only to have her report rewritten to credit a male colleague, the son of a general. Her message ended with 5 words that changed everything for me. Welcome to the sisterhood of the scars. I wasn't a single broken soldier anymore. I was part of an invisible army. My fight was their fight. Just as a sliver of hope began to warm me, my burner phone buzzed. A blocked number. I answered. Tessa? The voice was a strained whisper. It was Dorian Lex, another lieutenant from my unit, a good man I trusted. Dorian, what's wrong? Listen to me, he said, his words rushed. I don't have long. I don't know what you're planning, but you need to be careful. Word came down from on high. They're watching you. Your digital footprint, your calls, everything. Your father is pulling every string he has. The line went dead. I stood in the silence of the motel room, the phone still pressed to my ear. The fear was real, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. He was actively hunting me. But beneath the fear was something else, a strange, sharp sense of validation. Dorian's warning proved it. I was on the right path. I wasn't just chasing ghosts or fighting shadows. I was a real threat. And the men in power were starting to get scared. Dorian's warning echoed in my ears long after the call ended. Your father is pulling every string he has. I knew what that meant. My father wasn't a man who fought in the trenches. He was a man who moved pieces on a map from a command tent. His weapons weren't rifles. They were influence, reputation, and narrative. I just didn't realize how quickly he would deploy them. 2 days later, I was trying to feel normal. I was sitting in a small independent coffee shop downtown, the rich smell of roasted beans in the air, trying to read a book. The television in the corner was on, tuned to a popular conservative news channel, the volume just a low murmur. It was background noise until it wasn't. A familiar, patriotic musical score swelled, and I looked up. The screen was filled with the manicured grounds of the North Carolina Veterans Park. And there, sitting in a leather chair opposite a host with a serious expression, was my cousin Cade. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I just sat there, my coffee growing cold in my hands, and watched. Cade was in his full dress blues, medals gleaming under the studio lights. He looked like the perfect soldier, the perfect hero. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "A family's sacrifice. Marine hero speaks out." He retold the story from Syria, but it was a version I didn't recognize. In his telling, he was the calm center of the storm, making the tough calls while I, his younger cousin, struggled to keep up. He made it sound like a tragedy he had reluctantly survived. Then the host leaned in, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. There have been some difficult rumors, Captain Thorne. About your cousin, Lieutenant Cohen. Can you tell us how she's doing? Cade's face transformed. He looked down, shaking his head slowly, the very picture of reluctant sorrow. I love my cousin, he said, his voice thick with practiced emotion. I truly do. But the pressures of combat, they affect people in different ways. He looked up, directly into the camera. She's a good soldier, but she's not stable right now. She's a danger to herself and to the people around her. He'd done it. In front of millions of people, he had taken my trauma, my uniform, my service, and twisted it into a diagnosis. He hadn't just stolen my story, he'd branded me as a mentally unstable veteran, a walking, talking, ticking time bomb of PTSD. It was brilliant, and it was pure evil. I sat there, frozen, watching them cut to a commercial for a pickup truck. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was a soldier watching an enemy propaganda film. I was analyzing its effectiveness, its target audience, its cold, calculated cruelty. The real-world consequences came faster than I could have imagined. The next afternoon, I had to get groceries. I put on a baseball cap, pulled it down low, and went to the local Harris Teeter. But in a military town like Fayetteville, my face was now infamous. It started with the whispers, a low murmur that followed me down the cereal aisle. Then came the stares, a mixture of pity and contempt. I kept my eyes fixed on my shopping list, my knuckles white as I gripped the cart. Finally, as I was waiting in the checkout line, a woman stepped out from the line next to me. She was older, with a crisp haircut and a gold eagle pin on her lapel, the kind military spouses often wore. She stood directly in front of me, blocking my path. Her eyes were hard. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone around us to hear. Making a mockery of the uniform. "My husband served for 30 years. People like you spit on the honor of real soldiers." The cashier stopped scanning. The person behind me took a step back. Every eye was on me. In that moment, I wasn't a decorated Marine lieutenant. I was a pariah. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning wave of humiliation. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her, holding her gaze until she finally, uncomfortably, looked away. I paid for my groceries in absolute silence and walked out, the weight of 100 accusing stares on my back. The isolation was no longer a feeling. It was a physical wall pressing in on me from all sides. That night, back in the suffocating silence of my motel room, I was at my lowest point. They were winning. Their story, the better, simpler story, was taking hold. My truth was buried under an avalanche of lies. It was then that I saw the notification on my encrypted email client, a new message. It was from a name I recognized instantly, Anya Sharma. She was a legendary investigative journalist, a Pulitzer finalist known for exposing corruption and abuse within the military establishment. She was the person the Pentagon feared most. My fingers trembled as I opened the message. It was short and direct. "Lieutenant Cohen, I've been following the story being told about you in the media. I don't buy their version of events. My sources tell me there's more to it. If you have proof, I am prepared to listen. The truth deserves to be heard. Anya Sharma." My first instinct was a surge of hope, a desperate desire to pour out my entire story, the assault, the burned memories, the video, everything, to finally have someone believe me. But then, the training kicked in. The lessons from West Point, the voice of my old strategy professor, and a quote from Sun Tzu that suddenly felt more relevant than ever. "Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles." My father and Cade had revealed their strategy. They would isolate me and discredit me personally. If I came forward now, it would be my word, the word of an unstable woman, against theirs. They were waiting for me to attack their strongest point head-on. That would be a mistake. I had to let them expose their own weakness. So, I did something else. I spent the next 2 hours compiling the stories from the Sisterhood of the Scars. I removed all names and identifying details, creating a single, anonymous document. A dossier of systemic abuse, of stolen valor, of silenced women. Then I replied to Anya Sharma. My email was even shorter than hers. "Ms. Sharma, my story is just one of many. Start here." I attached the document and hit send. I wasn't just giving her a story, I was giving her a pattern. I wasn't the center of the narrative anymore. I was a symptom of a disease. I was laying a trail of breadcrumbs, leading not just to Cade and my father, but to the entire rotten system that enabled them. I was setting a trap. And now, all I had to do was wait for the enemy to make their next move. Sending that dossier to Anya Sharma was like launching a missile. You don't know exactly when or where it will land, but you know the landscape is about to change. It bought me time to think, to plan my next tactical move. My strategy had shifted. I was no longer just defending my own truth. I was preparing to dismantle their entire fortress of lies. Anya's reply came 2 days later. "I'm pursuing this. The pattern is undeniable. In the meantime, I've heard whispers of a Memorial Day event in DC. Your cousin is a keynote speaker. Might be a good place to observe the enemy. Observe the enemy. It was exactly what I was thinking. My mother, a history lover, once told me something I never forgot. The greatest tyrants don't fear bombs and bullets. They fear a single, unfaltering voice speaking the truth. I wasn't ready to speak to the world yet, but I was ready to speak to him. My first stop in Washington, D.C. wasn't the National Mall. It was the imposing neoclassical facade of the National Archives building. As a commissioned officer, I still had the right to request my own service records. I walked through the quiet, cathedral-like halls, my footsteps echoing on the marble floors. At the records desk, I was helped by an older man. A civilian employee whose stooped shoulders and faded Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm told me he was a fellow veteran. He looked at my request, then up at my face, his eyes lingering for a moment. I could see the flicker of recognition, the memory of the news cycle. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded and disappeared into the stacks. When he returned, he laid a thick file on the counter and slid a photocopied set of pages toward me. "Official copy for your records, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low gravel. He tapped a finger on one of the pages, the revised after-action report from Syria, the one that credited Cade with my actions. My father's signature, Thuong Ta Isaac Cohen, was a bold, arrogant slash of ink at the bottom. "Everything seems to be in order," the clerk said, but his eyes told a different story. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just one thing you might want to note, the approval stamp." He pointed to the official embossed seal next to my father's signature. "It's upside down, a rookie mistake. Usually happens when someone is in a hurry. Or when they're stamping something they got no business stamping." He looked at me, a long, understanding look. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in their perfect forgery, but it was everything. He had just handed me a key. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He was a brother in arms, in a war much quieter than the ones fought overseas. I took the train to the National Mall. The late May air was thick with the humidity that signals the start of a DC summer. I bought a bottle of water from a street vendor and found a spot on the grass, just another anonymous face in a sea of tourists and families. The event was being held right in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The Wall. A place so sacred it feels like the air around it is thinner, heavier. From a distance, I watched Cade arrive. He was in his immaculate dress blues, surrounded by a small entourage of aides and event organizers. He shook hands, smiled his polished smile, the very image of a confident, honorable leader. Then he stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent. He began to speak, his voice amplified by the sound system, rolling across the lawn. He spoke of sacrifice, of courage, of the unbreakable bond of brotherhood. He was using the memory of the dead as a shield for his own lies. And as he spoke, I watched his reflection warp and twist on the polished black granite of the wall behind him, a liar's face superimposed over the 58,000 names of the true and the brave. A cold, sharp fury coiled in my stomach. It wasn't hot and reckless. It was focused. It was lethal. When he finished, the crowd applauded politely. He stepped down from the stage, immediately swarmed by well-wishers wanting to shake the hand of a hero. I waited. I watched him soak in the undeserved adoration. Then I began to move. I didn't run. I didn't raise my voice. I walked with a calm, deliberate pace, weaving through the clusters of people. I was a ship cutting through water, my eyes locked on him. He was laughing at something someone said when he finally saw me. His smile froze on his face. The people around him sensed the shift in energy and fell silent, turning to see what had captured his attention. I stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he couldn't pretend he didn't see me, close enough for the people nearby to hear every word. I didn't look at them. I looked only at him, into his suddenly panicked eyes. My voice was level, clear, and just loud enough. "The medal on your chest," I said, my words dropping like stones into the sudden silence. "The report from Syria." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then I gestured with my chin toward the black wall behind him. "Do you ever feel ashamed, standing in front of the names on this wall?" The color drained from his face. A dozen different emotions flickered in his eyes: shock, fear, anger. Before he finally found his voice. "What? What are you talking about?" he stammered, his confident public persona crumbling into dust. A small, cold smile touched my lips. It held no humor, no warmth. It was the smile of a predator that has its prey cornered. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice still quiet, still controlled. "You can steal a medal. You can steal a story." I took a small step closer. "But you can never steal honor, because you never had it to begin with." And with that, I turned my back on him. I didn't wait for a response. I just walked away, melting back into the crowd, leaving him standing there, speechless and exposed in a sea of confused and whispering onlookers. I could feel their eyes on my back, but I didn't look back. The silent war was over. The public one had just begun. My public challenge at the memorial had poked the hornet's nest. I knew retaliation would come. I just didn't expect it to be so swift, or so vile. It arrived 3 days later in a manila envelope with the official Department of the Army letterhead. My hands were steady as I tore it open. Inside, the language was cold, bureaucratic, and utterly damning. It was an official notice from the Army Medical Command. Due to recent observed behavioral inconsistencies, I was being ordered to undergo a mandatory psychological evaluation and subsequent treatment. Failure to comply would result in an immediate medical discharge from the Marine Corps. My breath caught in my throat. But the real blow, the one that knocked all the air from my lungs, was in the attached supporting documents. It was a copy of my own medical file. And there, on a report from Womack Army Medical Center, was the X-ray of my broken ulna. The fracture was clear, the details were correct, except for one thing. The date. The document stated the X-ray had been taken on November 14th of the previous year, a full 6 months before Cade had attacked me. I stared at the date, my mind refusing to process it. It was a forgery. A clumsy, arrogant forgery. They had taken the evidence of his assault and twisted it into proof of my own instability. They were building a narrative, piece by piece, that I was a soldier with a history of self-harm, a woman prone to delusions. They weren't just trying to discredit me, they were trying to erase my sanity from the official record. Then I saw the signature at the bottom of the falsified report, Dr. Alistair Finch. My blood turned to ice. Dr. Finch wasn't just a military doctor. He was my father's Saturday morning golf partner, a permanent fixture at the Fort Liberty Officers Club. This wasn't just my father pulling strings anymore. This was the old boys club closing ranks, a network of powerful men protecting their own at any cost. The paper trembled in my hand. For a moment, I felt a crushing wave of despair. They had the system. They had the doctors. They could write reality any way they chose. But despair quickly burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard rage. I grabbed my car keys. I drove, not to the base, but to a patient-first urgent care clinic on the other side of town. The waiting room was filled with the mundane reality of civilian life. A kid coughing, a man with a sprained ankle. It was blessedly normal. "I need an X-ray of my right arm," I told the receptionist, my voice flat and even. "I need today's date and time clearly stamped on it." The technician was a young woman who looked at my arm, still bruised and tender, with concern. She didn't ask questions. She just did her job. An hour later, I walked out with a crisp, new X-ray in a large envelope. The digital timestamp in the corner was my anchor to reality. It was my proof. But I knew this fight was no longer about words or even videos. It was about official documents, about a war being fought on paper. Driving back to my motel, my mind was a storm. I felt trapped, cornered. I blindly flipped through the radio stations, trying to drown out the noise in my head. Static, pop music, commercials. Then a voice cut through the chaos, a voice rich with history and power. It was a recording of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I pulled over to the side of the road, the engine idling, and just listened. Justice rolls down like waters, a mighty stream. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear, the despair, it was washed away by that mighty stream. What remained was a purpose as clear and cold as steel. That night, the phone rang. The caller ID read Isaac Cohen. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up, saying nothing. His voice was everything I expected. Calm, reasonable, dripping with a sickening paternal concern. "Tessa," he began, his tone gentle. "I heard about the notice. I just want you to know, I'm only trying to help you." I remained silent, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles were white. "Just accept the treatment, honey," he continued, his voice like poison wrapped in velvet. "Go through the process. Everything will be okay. This is the best way for our family to get through this, to heal." To heal. The hypocrisy of it, the absolute gall of the man who had orchestrated my pain telling me how to heal from it, was breathtaking. He wasn't just a liar. He was a master gaslighter, trying to convince me that the cage he'd built for me was actually a sanctuary. That was it. That was the final push. The last drop. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. I simply pressed the end call button on the screen. The click was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. I sat in the dark for a long time. The rage was gone. The pain was gone. All that was left was a terrifying, liberating clarity. I stood up, walked to my laptop, and opened it. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I drafted a new email. The recipient, Anya Sharma. The subject line, "I'm ready. Here is the whole story." I started attaching the files one by one. The GoPro video from Syria, Nurse Carla's sworn affidavit, the falsified X-ray from Dr. Finch, the new correctly dated X-ray from the civilian clinic, the anonymous dossier from the Sisterhood of the Scars. As I attached that last file, I thought about how they tried to take my voice by calling me crazy. It's the oldest trick in the book, isn't it? If you have ever had someone try to silence you by questioning your sanity, support my fight by hitting that like button and let me know in the comments by just writing the words, "I hear you." Because in that moment, I knew I wasn't just speaking for myself anymore. I took a deep breath. My hand was perfectly steady as I moved the cursor over the send button. I had gone past the limit of my endurance. I would not be silent. I would not be erased. I would burn their whole world down. And I was about to light the match. I clicked send. Clicking send on that email was like pulling the pin on a grenade. I had done my part. Now, all I could do was wait for the explosion. It came less than 12 hours later. An email from Anya Sharma with a single line. "Call me. I have someone you need to meet." Anya didn't just report the news. She made connections. She put me in touch with a nonprofit organization called the Justice Shield Initiative, a group of lawyers who specialized in defending service members who had been abused by the system. Their office wasn't a high-rise palace of glass and steel. It was a modest ground-floor space in a quiet part of town, the kind of place you'd walk by without a second glance. It smelled of old books and freshly brewed coffee. My lawyer's name was Evelyn Reed. She was a sharp, impeccably dressed Black woman in her 50s, with eyes that missed nothing. She introduced herself as a former JAG Corps prosecutor. A shark. When she shook my hand, her grip was firm, her confidence radiating like a physical force. She had my entire dossier spread across her desk. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She gestured for me to sit, her eyes scanning the pages. "I've read it all, Lieutenant Cohen," she said, her voice a finely tuned instrument of precision and power. "The video, the affidavits, the dueling X-rays. It's a textbook case of reprisal, abuse of power, and conspiracy." She looked up from the papers and met my gaze, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she just studied me. Then a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "They made a critical mistake," she said, leaning forward. "They assumed you would break. Instead, you built a case. Now, we're going to make them pay for it." In that moment, a weight I didn't even know I was carrying lifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't just a victim. I was a client. I had an ally. The next piece of the puzzle came from the one person I least expected. A week later, I got a call from a burner phone. It was Dorian Lex. He sounded terrible, thin, exhausted, and scared. "Meet me at the public library in an hour," he whispered. "Come alone." He was waiting in the history section, tucked between shelves of Civil War biographies. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "I can't testify, Tessa," he said, his eyes darting around nervously. "Your father. He'd destroy my career, my life. I'm not brave like you." "I understand, Dorian," I said, and I meant it. "But I can't live with myself if I do nothing," he said, pressing a tiny black USB flash drive into my palm. His hand was cold and clammy. "This is from the unofficial command meeting the day after the attack. I was on duty, logging the minutes. My recorder was running." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Don't tell them where you got it. Just make it count." He turned and disappeared down the aisle before I could even thank him. Back in my motel room, I plugged the USB into my laptop. I put on my headphones and pressed play. The audio was clear. I heard my father's voice, cold and authoritative. "Get rid of her after action report. Bury it. This entire incident needs to disappear. The reputation of the Thorne and Cohen families is more important than the feelings of one emotional girl." The smoking gun. The final, undeniable proof of a deliberate conspiracy. I saved the file, my heart pounding in my chest. Evelyn was right. They were going to pay. The lawsuit was filed a week later. It was a quiet declaration of war. Their response was anything but. One night, as I was reading a biography of Harriet Tubman, a woman who knew a thing or two about fighting an impossible system, my phone buzzed with a notification from a local news app. Fire reported at a self-storage facility on Bragg Boulevard. My stomach dropped. It was the facility where I kept everything that wouldn't fit in my small apartment, everything that was left of my life before the attack. I drove there, seeing the flashing red and blue lights from miles away. The fire was out by the time I arrived, but the damage was absolute. My unit was a blackened, smoldering ruin. Firefighters were hosing down the last of the embers. They had torched it all. My old uniforms, my books, my photo albums, and my medals. My Purple Heart, my Bronze Star, every commendation I had ever earned. They were trying to erase every last physical trace of my service, of my honor. I stood there, breathing in the acrid smell of smoke and wet ash, and felt nothing. No tears, no anger, just a profound, empty calm. They had taken everything, and in doing so, they had left me with nothing left to lose. I walked over to the steaming wreckage and sifted through the debris with the toe of my boot. I saw a glint of metal. I reached down and picked it up. It was a lump of melted bronze, twisted and warped by the heat, once part of a metal. It was ugly and scarred. It was perfect. The next day, I found a small dusty jewelry shop downtown. The kind of old place that's been there forever. The owner was a man in his 60s with a kind face, a prosthetic leg, and a faded 101st Airborne tattoo. An Afghanistan vet. I placed the lump of metal on his counter. "Can you fix this?" he asked, his voice gentle. "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "I don't want you to fix it. I want you to reforge it. Not into anything perfect. I want it to keep the scars." He picked it up, turning it over in his calloused fingers. He understood. He didn't need me to explain. He was a soldier. He knew what scars meant. A few days later, he gave it back to me. It was no longer a shapeless lump. He had hammered and polished it into a small, simple pendant hung on a plain silver chain. It wasn't shiny. The surface was still rough, uneven, scarred by the fire. It wasn't a medal issued by the United States Marine Corps anymore. It was mine. And I would wear it on the day I went to court. The morning of the trial, I stood before the mirror in my small motel room. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I was in a simple, dark gray suit. Professional, civilian. Around my neck, resting against my skin, was the pendant. I closed my hand around the scarred, reforged metal. It felt warm, like it still held a memory of the fire. I thought of the phoenix, the mythical bird that rises from its own ashes, reborn and stronger than before. That's why I was here. Not for revenge. For rebirth. The Cumberland County Courthouse was an old, imposing brick building that tried to project an aura of timeless justice. Inside, the air was tense, thick with anticipation. I saw my father, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cohen, sitting in the front row behind Cade's legal team. He was the picture of military composure, his back ramrod straight, his expression a mask of calm confidence. He was a king in his court, certain of the outcome. The first part of the day was a blur of legal maneuvering. Cade's lawyer was slick, painting a picture of my cousin as a decorated war hero, a devoted family man, being harassed by his unstable, jealous younger cousin. Then Cade took the witness stand. He was brilliant, I had to give him that. He played the part of the reluctant, heartbroken victim to perfection. He spoke in a soft, pained voice about how he had always tried to look out for me. He described me as erratic and unpredictable since my return from deployment. She always had a competitive streak, Cade said, looking at the jury with sad, soulful eyes. When I was recognized for my service, she couldn't handle it. She snapped. He described the night of the attack as an episode of my own making. He claimed I had been drinking, that I had lunged at him in a fit of rage, and that I must have broken my own arm when I fell. He was calm, he was convincing, he was utterly believable. His lawyer then presented the falsified medical records as Exhibit A. As you can see from the date on this official Army medical document, the lawyer boomed. Lieutenant Cohen's injury occurred a full 6 months before the alleged incident with my client. This is a pattern of instability. I watched the faces of the jury. I could see the doubt creeping in. My father sat there, unmoved, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his lips. He thought he had won. They both did. Then it was Evelyn Reed's turn to cross-examine. She walked slowly toward the witness stand, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She was the calm at the center of the storm. She didn't have a stack of papers. She had nothing but her own sharp mind. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice polite, almost gentle. "That was a very compelling story." She paused. "So compelling, in fact, that I think the court deserves to see the event that earned you such recognition." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present a short video taken from my client's helmet camera during her mission in Syria." Cade's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Relevance?" The witness's testimony has centered on his character and heroism in the field, which he claims is the source of my client's jealousy. Evelyn countered smoothly. "This video is directly relevant to that claim." "I'll allow it," the judge said, looking intrigued. "Proceed." The lights in the courtroom dimmed. A large screen descended from the ceiling, and the video played. The chaotic, shaky footage filled the screen. The sound of gunfire, shouting. The jury saw me, dragging 2 wounded Marines behind a crumbling wall. And then, the camera panned, and the courtroom saw Cade. He was huddled in on himself, his rifle shaking, his face a mask of pure terror. He was paralyzed. Then came the audio, crystal clear over the courtroom speakers, the voice of a wounded soldier I had just saved. "Thanks, Cohen. You saved my life." The courtroom was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. All eyes flicked from the heroic image of me on screen to the man on the witness stand. Cade's face was ashen. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by the same slack-jawed terror we were all seeing on the screen. Evelyn let the silence hang in the air for a long, brutal moment before she spoke again. "I have just one more piece of evidence, Your Honor." She nodded to her assistant, who pressed a button. This time, there was only audio. A voice, cold and familiar, filled the courtroom. My father's voice. "Get rid of her after action report. Bury it. This entire incident needs to disappear. The reputation of the Thorne and Cohen families is more important than the feelings of one emotional girl." A collective gasp went through the room. I didn't look at Cade, I looked at my father. The courtroom camera followed my gaze, zooming in on his face. The mask was gone. The composure had shattered. In its place was the wild, panicked look of a man whose world had just been obliterated by his own words. He was no longer a king. He was just a defeated old man. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand, my back straight, my steps even. I didn't look at Cade. I didn't look at my father. I looked directly at the 12 men and women in the jury box. I told them my story. My voice didn't shake. It was calm. It was steady. It was the voice my mother had told me to find. When I was done, I reached up and unclasped the silver chain from my neck. I held up the scarred, reforged piece of metal for them to see. The night they knew this trial was coming, they burned down my storage unit, I said, my voice ringing with clarity. They burned my uniforms, my commendations, my history. I held the pendant higher. They burned my medals, but they could not burn my honor. They tried to erase me, but they only made me stronger. Then, for the first time, I turned my head. I looked away from the jury and directly at the man in the front row, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life trying to earn. I let him see the finality in my eyes, and I spoke my last words to the court. That man, I said, my voice clear and cold as ice, Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Cohen, is no longer my father. The judge's gavel came down with a final, decisive crack. The sound echoed in the suddenly silent courtroom, a punctuation mark at the end of the war. Victory doesn't feel the way you see in the movies. There's no swell of triumphant music. There's no slow-motion embrace. There's just a hollow silence. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins for months vanished, and in its place was an exhaustion so profound it felt like it went down to my bones. The verdict was read. Cade Thorne was found guilty on all counts: assault, perjury, conduct unbecoming of an officer. He was sentenced to 15 years in a military prison and a dishonorable discharge, stripped of every rank and honor he had stolen. He just stared blankly, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant man who had taken the stand. As for my father, the legal maneuvering behind the scenes had spared him a prison sentence. In exchange for his full cooperation, the military allowed him to take a forced retirement. His career was over, ending not with a parade, but with a whisper of disgrace. He sat perfectly still as his fate was read, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the wall, refusing to look at me. The king had been checkmated. Justice, on paper, had been served. As Evelyn and I walked out of the courthouse, blinking in the bright Carolina sun, we were swarmed by reporters. Evelyn handled them with her usual grace, but I just wanted to disappear. I felt numb, disconnected from the scene. Then, a woman pushed through the crowd. She was in her late 50s, with kind, tired eyes that looked so much like my mother's. She gently took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I had to thank you," she said, her voice trembling, tears welling in her eyes. "My daughter. She was in the army. She served in Afghanistan." The woman took a shaky breath. "Things happened. She wasn't strong enough to speak up like you did. We lost her 3 years ago." A tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "Thank you for fighting for her. For all our girls who couldn't." Her words hit me harder than any verdict. I saw my own fight reflected in her grief, and I understood that the battle I had just won wasn't only mine. It belonged to her daughter, too. And to every name in the dossier, from the Sisterhood of the Scars, it was a victory heavy with the ghosts of battles lost. A few days later, I received a small handwritten letter in the mail. It was from the old veteran clerk at the National Archives. The note inside was short. "Thank you, Lieutenant, for all of us." The hardest part was going back to the house, my childhood home. It was being sold, the contents divided or discarded. I went back for one last box of my mother's books. Isaac Cohen was there. We passed each other in the central hallway. The walls were bare, littered with pale rectangles where family photos had hung for decades, like ghosts on the wallpaper. He looked smaller, older. The rigid military posture was gone, replaced by the stoop of a defeated man. He stopped, and for a moment, I thought he was going to speak. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. There was no apology in his eyes, no remorse, just the vast, empty silence of a bridge that has been burned to ashes. I didn't wait for the words that would never come. I just gave a small, formal nod and walked past him. It was the last time we ever saw each other. My final act as a Marine was to report to my old commanding officer, a graying colonel on the verge of his own retirement. His office was filled with the scent of old leather and the quiet dignity of a long career. He didn't make me stand at attention. He gestured for me to sit. On his desk lay two things: a freshly printed copy of the original, unedited after-action report from Syria, the one that detailed my real actions, and beside it, a velvet box containing the Purple Heart I had earned. "The review board has officially corrected the record, Lieutenant," he said, his voice laced with a weary respect. "Your name is cleared. There's a formal apology from the Corps and a full reinstatement of your rank and position, effective immediately. This all belongs to you. You fought for it, you earned it." I looked at the papers, I looked at the medal. These were the things I'd nearly died for, the things I'd sacrificed everything to reclaim, the symbols of a life I'd believed in so fiercely. And I felt nothing. I gently pushed them back across the desk. "Thank you, Colonel," I said, and my voice was steady. "But I don't need them anymore." He looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know what the truth is," I said, a sense of peace settling over me for the first time. "And that's all I need." I stood up and offered my hand. "It was an honor to serve, sir." He shook it, his eyes filled with a sad understanding. I walked out of his office, out of the building, and for the first time, I wasn't walking toward a battlefield. I was walking away from one. I had chosen to be honorably discharged, not as a victim pushed out of the service, but as a soldier who had completed her final mission. That night, alone in my motel room, I remembered a passage my mother used to read to me from the Bible, from Psalm 23. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me." I realized I had walked through my valley, and I had come out the other side, alone perhaps, but no longer afraid. 6 months after I walked away from the Marine Corps, I used the settlement money to buy a small, salt-weathered cottage in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The constant, angry noise of the Fayetteville military base and the suffocating tension of the courtroom were replaced by a new sound: the gentle rhythmic shushing of waves on the shore. Peace didn't come like a lightning bolt. It seeped in slowly like the morning mist that rolled in off the Atlantic. I found it in the simple act of walking barefoot on the cool sand at dawn, letting the ocean foam wash over my ankles. I found it not by trying to forget my past, but by finally accepting it as a part of the landscape of my life, as permanent and weathered as the dunes. In the small patch of sandy soil beside my porch, I started a garden. I planted sunflowers, dozens of them. I liked watching them, how they would turn their broad, open faces to follow the light across the sky, no matter how harsh the wind blew. They were resilient. They were survivors. One rainy afternoon, I was finally unpacking the last of the few boxes I'd managed to salvage from my old life. It was a box of my mother's books, their spines soft and worn. As I lifted out an old copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, I felt a slight shift in the bottom of the box, a false bottom. My fingers trembled as I pried it open. Tucked inside was a hidden compartment, and in it a single, sealed envelope overlooked by my father and Cade in their haste to purge the past. My mother's elegant handwriting was on the front, "For my Tessa." I sat on the floor, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, and opened the last letter my mother ever wrote me. "My dearest daughter," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, but my love for you is not. I'm writing this because I know the world you are walking into. It is a world of men, of honor defined by their rules. There will be times when that world will try to extinguish your voice. It will tell you to be quiet for the sake of family, for the sake of honor. It will tell you that your truth is an inconvenience. But I want you to know this. True honor lives in the truth. Your truth. It is the most powerful thing you will ever own. So please, my darling girl, use your voice. Be the fire I was never brave enough to become. Know that wherever I am so, so proud of you. Tears. I didn't know I still had streamed down my face, dripping onto the page. It wasn't a cry of grief. It was a cry of release. For my entire life, I had been fighting to live up to my father's definition of honor. But here, in her final words, my mother had given me my own. It was the last piece of absolution, the final permission I needed to truly begin to heal. A few weeks later, I started volunteering at a local veterans outreach center. It was a humble place run on donations and strong coffee. I didn't want to be a counselor or a teacher. I just wanted to listen. So, with the center's blessing, I started a small, informal gathering every Tuesday night, a support group for female vets. The first night, only 3 women showed up. We sat in a circle on mismatched folding chairs under the hum of a fluorescent light. I had made a fresh pot of coffee. For a long time, we just sat in silence, the comfortable silence of people who don't need to explain their scars. Then, to break the ice, I told my story. Not the clipped, factual version I'd presented in court, but the whole, messy, painful truth. I spoke of the attack, of the betrayal, of the ashes of my mother's memories, and of the long walk through the valley of the shadow. When I finished, the room was quiet. A young woman across from me, a former Army medic barely in her 20s, was crying silently. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and she whispered 2 words that changed everything. Me too. And just like that, the circle was complete. The sisterhood of the scars had been reborn, not in the anonymous darkness of the internet, but here in the warm, imperfect light of a community center. My legacy, I realized, was not in the medals I had won or the enemies I had defeated on the battlefield. It was here. It was in creating a space where another woman could feel safe enough to say those 2 words and to be heard. It was in turning my pain into a bridge for someone else to walk across. The story ends here, but my life did not. I'm still living in that cottage by the sea. The sunflowers in my garden are now taller than I am. The reforged pendant doesn't hang around my neck anymore. I hung it on a hook on my front porch, right by the door. It's not a weapon now. It's a wind chime. Some mornings, the rising sun hits it just right, and it catches the light, scattering fractured rainbows across my doorstep. It reminds me that even scarred things can make something beautiful. I'm no longer Lieutenant Cohen, the soldier who fought a war. I'm just Tessa, the woman who is healing. Sometimes when the ocean breeze blows just right, I stand on my porch and whisper to the wind as if I'm talking to my mother. I'm using my voice, Mom, I say, a quiet smile on my face. I'm using it. Because justice wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. My story found its beginning when I decided to use my voice. Maybe you have a story that's waiting for its beginning too. It doesn't have to be a shout, it can start with a whisper. Thank you for listening to my journey today. If it resonated with you in any way, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel, where we share stories that remind us we are not alone. And in the comments below, I'd be honored if you would simply write 3 words, "My voice matters," because it does.